that, I'll hand the virtual microphone over to Paul Sonnier and start the program. Paul, how are you?
I'm great, Stan. Thank you very much. Looking forward to another exciting event that you've put together, you and Justin. Congratulations. So I am Paul Sonnier. I'm the author of The Fourth Wave Digital Health, and many may know me as being responsible for, via my almost 90,000 member digital health group on LinkedIn, for initiating the digital health meme around the globe over the last decade. And promulgating the definition that digital health is the convergence of the digital and genomic revolutions with health, healthcare, living, and society. Moreover, as I point out in my book, these two converging revolutions are driving a fourth great era of human and societal progress, aka the fourth wave. So I also work with a brilliant team of 3,000 plus colleagues at PA Consulting, where we assist all types of organizations in the health and life sciences and beyond to innovate, transform, and succeed in this new and exciting era. So today I have the pleasure of speaking with two experts in the field of digital health, whom I've been fortunate enough to get to know over the past several months. We'll be discussing digital health regulation, particularly around FDA regulated products that could be integrated with pharmaceutical products, and opportunities and considerations with bringing them to market. So I'll be joined by my friends, hopefully I can say that, Zina Manji, who is Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Innovation at GSK, and Nikki Batista, who is Director of Digital Health Regulatory Affairs at MCRA Digital Health. So with that, Nikki, let's start with you. Would you mind giving us a brief introduction of yourself and your focus at MCRA?
Yeah, sure. It's a pleasure to be here, Paul and Zina, with you both. I have 7 years background in regulatory affairs. The majority of that was spent at US FDA, where I moved up the ranks within CDRH, specifically within the cardiovascular devices group, starting out in interventional cardiology and moving into cardiac diagnostic devices, which is where I really got much of my exposure to digital health and played a role in the formative policies that the now Digital Health Center of Excellence is implementing and administrating at the agency. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation and hopefully shed some of my experience and share it with everyone.
Yeah, well, great to have you, Nikki. Love your background. Zina, would you like to share your background, please?
Yeah, sure. Really happy to join you both, Nikki and Paul. It's been great putting this panel together. So my experience has been in regulatory affairs in industry for 21 years, and so has changed dramatically during that time. And my current role over the past several years has been focused on innovation, and of course, by definition, that means emerging science and the changes that happen and how you can look at transforming healthcare, bringing forward novel products and solutions. So engaging in that way, and you know, I'm really excited about what we can do in the future. So that said, you know, the views I expressed today are my own, but really happy to join this conversation.
Well, it's wonderful to have you, both of you. And so we did prepare some questions, which I'm excited to ask both of you. We'll have more of a fireside chat approach. So instead of just asking each of you individually a question, I'll just throw a question out there, and please feel free to respond. Hopefully no fighting over the answering. So first question, let's talk about non-regulated products used in a clinical trial. When does a digital solution need to be regulated? When used alongside a drug, which is the question I was asking both of you. And what would you need to think about when choosing which vendor to partner with? Another important question.
So I can go ahead and get started, at least on that first portion. So I'm going to give the classic regulatory response, and that it depends. And it's really true, and it's a frustrating answer to get, but it's really challenging to put many technologies into finite boxes, because the use cases, the technology, it's driving these devices really poses unique and challenging questions from a regulation standpoint that have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So when we think about integrating existing digital tools into the workflow of maybe a pharmaceutical company or the administration of pharmaceutical products, it's really important to assess the various digital health policies that the agency has set forth. And there's a number of them to consider, including things like clinical decision support, general wellness, deciding if it even meets the definition of a medical device from a statutory standpoint. And this is primarily driven by intended use. So it's really, really important for companies to think about, how am I actually using this technology in the particular use case I'm interested in? Because it might change how the device was originally presented by its own original manufacturer. So I think those are some important things to consider. And that's why it's important to have experienced partners in the conversation that have navigated these pathways before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, this is why it's really important to bring forward your regulatory professionals early in the conversation. Certainly using wellness products, in a clinical trial. They have an intended use as a wellness device, as predefined as a wellness device. But you really have to consider how you're using it in the clinical trial. You could actually be changing the intended use of that product depending on how you're using it in the clinical trial. So being really clear about what's the purpose, what's the goal, not only of the trial, but what outcome are you actually trying to develop and go forward with, so that the results of the trial are usable towards what you're actually trying to develop.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of thinking about the types of stakeholders you might want to engage with, I think something that we've done with clients in my current role at MCRA, where I have the pleasure of working with a ton of innovators in this digital health space, and it's really important to assess risk. The risk associated from a regulatory standpoint, from a quality standpoint, and incredibly important from a cybersecurity standpoint is, how are we integrating these tools into your clinical study or workflow that might be, like Zina said, deviating from that original intended use. So it's really a holistic risk assessment, due diligence that needs to occur when you're looking for partners in this space.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, Paul, go ahead. I think when you're thinking about this also, designing forward, right? So you have to consider the infrastructure you need to have to actually, go forward towards a launch of the product. So you might do the study and you get a great outcome, but in terms of privacy, data security, cybersecurity, total product life cycle, you have to have the infrastructure to then actually continue, on towards the development, towards the launch of that product. So forward thinking on that can also help you frame your study and again, define your intended use.
Yeah, well, thank you both. Sounds like it's not something to be afraid of necessarily. Just make sure you consult the right experts and have the right processes in place. And so if we look at the more traditional side of regulated digital health devices that are non-consumer or wellness, what would be the unique regulatory barriers and considerations to these FDA regulated devices?
Yeah, I think again, it goes towards what data are you generating, and is that data actually useful? So, I think that's a key aspect from a regulator standpoint of, is the data reliable, reproducible? Does it contribute to the benefit risk? I think that's a key challenge to always address. But in the shifting adaptation that you need to go through, and you might go through several iterations, being consistent with that as you iterate is going to be absolutely key. So as regulators, I think a key aspect of addressing that challenge with the regulators is think of yourself in the regulator's shoes and being clear on how you're explaining what you're doing. That will make the conversation much more clear and getting clearer advice actually as well when you're meeting with the regulators.
Yeah, and I can't claim rights to this term, but Zina introduced me to this concept of regulatory reform, and it's something that I think collectively are trying to do without really putting a name to it. And we know that this is driven by innovation, and innovation inherently is presenting novel questions to these reviewers. So as being a previous reviewer in my past life, it's challenging to know what are the appropriate questions to ask when you're assessing the safety and efficacy of the device. So it's absolutely critical to go into engaging with the agency, not as like barriers, like what Zina and I have talked about in the past, but there are more opportunities to collaborate with the agency and see them as a partner in the development lifecycle of your product, because at the heart of it, FDA is learning with industry, and industry is not only responsible for driving innovation, but there is this responsibility to educate the FDA on their subject matter expertise in that specific device sector, that discipline. And so it's a learning process. And so I think that it's really a collaboration, that the barriers, at least with the agency, are really challenges and opportunities to collaborate and have an open dialogue. And this is something that the FDA is more vocal about now in terms of how to implement AI and machine learning, is this concept of explainability and transparency. They need to have sufficient information to understand how these devices are actually being used in the field, how they're actually designed to be used, so that they can ask the right questions. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. And also the software pre-certification program. I mean, I think FDA has really taken kind of a crowdsourcing mindset to, let's talk to our stakeholders, because FDA has publicly said, they acknowledge the pace of innovation is accelerating. And if regulatory reforms and pathways, infrastructure is not also innovating at pace, that will create barriers to good healthcare products coming out. And so, AI machine learning pre-cert program, industry has been on the same table, at the table with FDA, looking at what are the challenges and what framework actually is usable and workable. So I think it's really interesting. And I think, sometimes people come with the perception that, regulatory, there's just barriers all over the place and there's no guidance on this and I don't know how to do this. And FDA isn't even, saying anything about it. I think, that's where we say, you're driving regulatory reform with innovations. And the more data, the more engagement FDA has with novel products and novel situations, the more that can actually contribute to regulations being written. So you really have to bring examples and not be afraid of no examples actually being there. That's actually the definition of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one more thing is something I've experienced with a number of clients now, is that they approach the regulatory challenge and opportunities as though they need to conform the design of their technology to meet regulatory expectations. And that mentality is backwards, right? Innovation should be driven by user needs and unmet clinical needs, which drives the business, and then the business drives regulatory. Whereas in reality, sometimes we're seeing it backwards. And I don't think FDA wants to see that either, but this is where that collaboration is really, really critical.
Yeah, I think you're both highlighting what we've all seen over the last several years, which is digital health innovation really driving this ecosystem partnership holistically, where FDA, it's amazing really to see regulators step up and say, yes, we want to help foster innovation in the life sciences, health and life sciences. So it's really great that you're both pointing out that, yes, there are challenges, but I think the opportunities are there and not to be afraid of them. And And it is a learning experience for all of us, right? As you're also both pointing out. So with that, the next question I wanted to ask both of you is about companion apps and devices in particular used in pharma. Could we talk more about that? And especially in my favorite tongue twister, real world evidence. So just take it away on that question, if you may.
I can start off with the companion apps. I think what's interesting is when we think about how FDA will classify a technology such as a companion app used in conjunction with a pharmaceutical product, is FDA will call this a combination product. So this means that there's a lead center reviewing your application, and then there's a secondary center supporting that review. And it's a challenge with every combination product I've ever been a part of, is that there can be a disconnect between the two centers involved at the agency, and primarily driven by one center leads the clinical utility, the clinical application of the product, and the other drives the technical aspect. So in the case of companion apps, you have CDRH most likely leading the review of the software product, and then you have CDER driving the clinical utility of the pharmaceutical package or total product. So in that case, this is where that transparency and explainability really come in, so that there's a comprehensive picture of what your device is intended to do. And a tactic we take here at MCRA is always leveraging benefit risk profile analysis, because it really contextualizes the use of these technologies. And being at FDA, I've learned that it's really easy to default to the worst possible scenario of how the software might be implemented. So it's critical that we contextualize every application with a benefit risk assessment to really drive and justify the data packages that we are going to submit to the agency to support approval or clearances.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, being really clear about who your stakeholders are, within the FDA as well, and depending on what division you're looking at in terms of therapeutic area, and also your stakeholders, the users, the physicians, the clinical support team who are going to be using these products, that can also help you frame the risk benefit equation in a way that's meaningful. And again, goes back to, it's an education and then telling the story to FDA. When it comes to real world evidence, I think it's a huge transformative opportunity. I mean, as we've talked about, Nikki and Paul, the randomized clinical trials are not necessarily showing the ground truth of as you described, Nikki, of what actually is really happening. And I think what digital health is really driven and enabled is looking at healthcare from a day-to-day aspect. And I remember Medtronic a few years ago mentioned at a MedTech conference was, what's the future? It's making the patient a better patient. And from a consumer aspect, staying healthy. So that everyday, day-to-day data that you can get can really change the clinical outcome and what measures you're actually looking at, which historically are based on, sometimes decades old data, clinical trials. But now you're looking at patients in a personalized way, and how they're day-to-day living with disease or managing conditions. So when you look at real-world evidence, then it goes back again, what are you actually measuring? Because the challenge is, what are the acceptable alternative data sources? So I think that's where you also need to look at, what's the purpose of that data source? How are you maintaining the integrity of that data? How are you looking at the insights from that data? And how does it help with the healthcare system? If the physician is looking at the data, is it giving just more data for the physician to look at? That's going to be very burdensome. But if it's usable, meaningful, it can drive clinical decision making. The patient or the consumer can understand what alerts they're getting from any remote patient monitoring. All of these things have to, come into play. Will help you better design your real world evidence trial or data sources and picking the right data sources, but also then how you support with FDA that this is a reliable data source, and therefore this should support this indication or this label change or quality of life or whatever parameter you're trying to support. Then it's also, looking at pre-market and post-market. What is kind of the purpose of the real world evidence data and how you're using it?
Yeah, I think the points you're both making emphasize that consumers, patients are either knowingly or unknowingly partners in this ecosystem. And that's critical to innovation and moving forward in this space. And I think we're coming up on time, so we may not be able to get to our last question about the Digital Health Center of Excellence, but I think we covered that a little bit. So Stan, why don't I hand it over to you again, and thank you, Zina and Nikki, for a great panel. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, Paul, as well, for a wonderfully moderated session. And again, Zina, Nikki, incredible details on the, really not surprising given Zina's background with GSK and everything that she does with the compliance, that the risk and risk mitigation is critical there. And thank you all